Well, I hope you don't get too upset. This is actually quite a short sermon. It's true. It's going to be short. And I was worried you were going to be so upset that it wasn't going to be 30 minutes. It's short because this particular passage, to me, is pretty clear what's happening for myself. First, it makes me think of the phrases, no justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. You familiar with that phrase? Right? It's a powerful phrase that very much still needs to be heard loudly out on the streets every single day possible. In this sermon today, I think many of you may learn a lot from me, or you may realize, yeah, of course, that's Jorge saying those things up there. And so I want to start with saying that I believe that the system is rigged. It has always been. Prosecutors manipulate grand juries. These are things I believe. Rapists from elite families get special leniency. And I'm not going to say any names. You're going to know who I may be referring to on your own. Laws that stipulate minimum sentences for certain crimes prey on black and brown people. Greedy bankers dupe their clients and detonate the economy for their own gain and hardly receive a slap on the wrist. And now, of course, as a Chicano looking through that lens, growing up, always on the margins looking in, these are things that I have always carried with me and continue to believe in, suspicious of our own system. But sometimes a reason for hope breaks through. Sometimes a president commutes unfair prison sentences. Sometimes someone says enough regarding private prisons and their miserable track records. But most of the time, it's the same system following the same old story, isn't it? Maybe I'm alone. I don't know. Injustice and human misery offend the conviction that God is merciful, loving, and powerful. For a long time, therefore, the patterns of systemic injustice have gnawed at people of faith, even as such people remain complicit in the systems. For example, justice never prevails. The prophet Habakkuk complains to God. Job lamented why God remained silent and apparently indifferent while he suffered. I call aloud, but there is no justice. Describing the abuses perpetrated by those who wield power, the prophet Micah said, their hands are skilled to do evil. The official and the judge ask for a bribe, and the powerful dictate why they desire it. Thus they pervert justice. As a minister, an ordained minister, I take pride in being a complainer. People of faith are complainers. We should be. This is not because we are naturally grumpy. I mean, sometimes. Rather, by complaining about injustice, we demand a different world, don't we? We expect God to keep promises, and we ache to see God's intentions for human flourishing become realities. So we continually do what we can to see those hopes become real. In Luke 18, verses 1 through 8, the passage we just heard, Jesus tells a parable about a complainer par excellence. She's a widow who refuses to put up with a biased, unyielding system, doesn't she? She uses the weapon she has: tenacity, and perhaps an unflinching willingness to use her low standing to humiliate an iron-hearted scoundrel who refuses to apply the law fairly. Her continuous efforts to get the right outcome finally annoy an unjust judge so much that he yields, granting the justice she sought. Whatever it takes to get rid of her, right? On a primary level, I believe the parable has more to say about God, who is the object of faith, than about the nature of faith itself. The parable illustrates God's reliability. It says that even someone as slimy as a crooked judge can finally be goaded to enact a just ruling. How much more can we count on a loving and mindful God to respect our tireless plea for justice? At the same time, the parable also subtly characterizes God as a slow-to-respond authority figure. Like the derelict judge who is the widow's nemesis, the parable urges readers who are struck by what a mess things are to remain vigilant and praying, "Your kingdom come, your will be done." But there is also another dimension to the parable. By commending the widow and depicting her unflagging efforts as an illustration of prayer, the parable construes her and her actions as expressions in what I believe of Christian faith. She provides an embodied and active example of discipleship. Her faithfulness shines forth in her complaints as well as in her determination to see restoration become a reality. Her activism is prayer. The faith she expresses then isn't a passive wish that things may someday be better. Because the insistent widow illustrates faithfulness, her actions also characterize what Christians, what I believe, are called to do. Christian faith is a restless faith. It always responds with frustration to the brokenness of our societies and our very selves. For I believe God has made a non-negotiable commitment to bring better things into being. Christian faith, for me, channels that restlessness into prayer. It also channels that restlessness into widow-like advocacy that demands a response from God, doesn't it? the wider society and its leaders. Christians, as individuals and communities, we are daily to demand justice from those who have the power to grant it. This advocacy uses whatever tools are available, sometimes wealth and political influence, sometimes political and moral arguments, sometimes persistence and annoyance, my favorite, sometimes reckless love, good trouble, right? Sometimes a willingness to expose absurd and inhumane practices. Whatever it takes to get the system to change, even if only a little. So, obviously, I believe churches, communities of faith should be complaining churches, no matter who are the power brokers in a given moment. Amen? Amen. No matter Republican or Democrat, we should always constantly be speaking out to a system that continues to hurt and take away people's dignity in this society. This is true whether the authorities are utterly unjust, like the parable's judge, or relatively just and generous, like a president who shows a commitment to addressing racism and the need for criminal justice reform. Lobbying individual presidents, members of Congress, and governors is one thing. But people of faith should be keeping their eyes on a bigger thing, for they contend against a corrupted and unfair system. A nice amen would be nice right there for those that agree. Yeah. People who demand justice from a system need to remain especially vigilant, something I know CCSM has done so well for many, many years. Certainly, some of the vigilance expresses itself in elections and all the drama, debate, and platform making that occurs prior to any kind of elections. And we know that elections are pivotal moments with far-reaching outcomes. We know that progress gained in the recent years can find itself reversed in a flash when a nation's leader changes, right? At the same time, elections and their accompanying hype have a way of distracting us from a more basic calling. Christians care about more than who does or does not get elected. In the American political context, Christians engage in advocacy to promote the well-being of their neighbors and all who find themselves denied justice. Advocacy seeks to help to keep elected officials accountable to a vision of justice and to put pressure on them to enact appropriate policies or reforms. The advocacy looks different for all of us, depending on where one resides. Some churches will aggressively lobby elected officials, locally and nationally. In other faith communities, advocacy occurs when people construct a slight more just society on their own. They can redouble efforts to support the local food shelf or could enlist more volunteers to staff the tutoring program for local students whose schools have been stripped of necessary resources. A member of churches will commit themselves to assisting in the resettlement of refugees. Many will take to the streets in bold activism, or sit in quiet solidarity with people who, like Job, keep calling out loud but experience no justice. So, sisters and brothers, no matter what, the people of God remain dedicated complainers in all seasons. And those complaints we see a sign of what faith on earth looks like. Amen.